The first question. What I meant when I said that despite globalization the world is becoming provincial is that when you live in a world that is dominated totally by money and making money, and the market is seen fundamentally, a sort of form of market fundamentalism, as the mechanism by which everything in this society can be sorted out, whether it's in the realm of politics, education, culture, health, then it really produces a state of despair. And people are so concerned with, for understandable reasons of making sure that they earn some money, that is all they concentrate on, to put it at its bluntest. That the rest of the world can go hell. What they will do is concentrate on their own lives. And, you know, there's a systemic pattern to this. That in the decades, the first 3 decades, more or less, after the Second World War, in the last century, you had, that's what gave people like Polanyi hope, that they said the system needs to go further in that direction. That you had the creation of social welfare systems which gave protection to the people, which provided free state education, and for large numbers of young people from poor, working class, less well-off backgrounds, a free university education. So young people who went to universities in the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s knew 2 things. A, that they didn't have to worry about where the money was coming from. The state was educating them. And B, linked to that, that when they left the education system, there would be jobs waiting. That is now all gone, or more or less gone. And so young people, and this is sort of not, you know, a coincidence that it's gone, that is the way the system has decided to take it. And that has made people concentrate much more on their everyday conditions and everyday lives. Third point on that is that the end of the Cold War, which was the more or less the trigger for the turbocharged globalization that we've seen, meant one thing which was very disastrous in my opinion. What was that? That during the Cold War, because the West, the United States and its allies, were fighting against a system that was based on a one-party state, no elections, people locked up in many of these European countries or in China or in Russia for holding dissident views. What the aim of the West was to show we're really different. And so the Western media networks, the Western press, encompassed far more wide-ranging views than they do now. Because they had to show we're better than you. And this was true in more or less every single country of the West. That has now gone. And so the decline in the quality of the media is very interesting. With the ending of the Cold War, many newspapers, to give you just one example, called all their, or kept foreign correspondents only in the key countries. And in some cases that meant the United States. They even removed them from Russia and China and India and Brazil, leave alone Africa, apart from South Africa. So all that changed the way in which the world thought. And that is what has happened, and that is now being challenged and questioned not by the mainstream media, which goes from bad to worse, in my opinion, everywhere, but by young indie journalists who put stuff up on the web, which suddenly, when they hit on something which is really important, becomes huge and can't be ignored. So it's different now, but you have to really go and search for it. On what US plans are, the key issue which is being discussed now is Iran. And here the big pressure comes from the Israelis. We should be very blunt here, because they don't want to lose their nuclear monopoly in the region. That is where the pressure is coming from. According to what I read and people I talk to, there is huge opposition to any war on Iran from within the Pentagon. that many of the American generals realized that a war on Iran could turn out to be a huge disaster, even more than Iraq, because it's a war that could flood 4 different parts of the world. If the Iranians say the gloves are off, well, we'll fight as best we can then. So there is resistance. It's mainly the politicians who are talking it up, both in America and in Europe, for that reason. As for the question, let's just take the sort of cause for this aggression and the economic sanctions against Iran, which of course, as we know, always affect ordinary people more than anyone else. The Iranians are developing nuclear reactors. They're denying that they're developing nuclear weapons. I don't know whether they are or not. It may be, I mean, just looking at it cold-bloodedly, developing and getting nuclear weapons is now seen by countries not as an act of aggression, but as a defensive act to protect themselves against the United States, mainly. That's why they do it. So Iran is surrounded by countries with nuclear weapons. Israel is here, Pakistan has got nuclear weapons, India has got nuclear weapons, China has got nuclear weapons, American ships armed with nuclear missiles roam through its waters. American submarines have penetrated its, sometimes penetrated its security reason. So they say, many Iranians who are even hostile to the regime have said to me, why shouldn't we have them? And who decides whether we get them or not? Why should the West decide? So that is not an unpopular demand inside Iran itself, by the way. So if people think that knocking out these nuclear reactors is going to create an Arab Spring in Tehran, be warned. It is going to unite a large bulk of the population behind the clerics. That is what is going to happen, and people are telling Obama and the gang that, but they don't listen, because they are now concerned and obsessed, as good American politicians, with the outcome of the next election. And how to make sure that it's definitely in the bag. In my opinion, the next US election is going to be determined by the state of the economy. And if the Republicans can find someone who can say a few words without sounding totally nutty. If they can, then you might have a contest. Probably Romney will give it. Though, I mean, I have to be honest that the only candidate in this election who is questioning the American military bases abroad in the empire and is therefore kept out is Ron Paul. He at least questions it. And everyone immediately ignores him because this is something which can't even be discussed, whether the American empire should be gradually phased out and the military bases reduced. You'd have thought for a country with a huge external debt, it might be a sensible thing to do. But anyway, so that debate is going on. On the question of the future of Sub-Saharan Africa, it is not unrelated to everything else I've been saying on the changes that are needed and are necessary and the role that the state should play. One of the huge tragedies, huge in the sense that it was felt the most, was that the so-called Washington Consensus, as it used to be called, the system of neoliberal economics, whereby the state does nothing and removes even the elementary social safety nets that were set up in these countries after they became independent, and encourages people to mimic the Western system, has been a huge disaster for every African country, including, by the way, South Africa. That was the part of the deal in dismantling apartheid, which was a huge gain, it can't be denied. But that was the deal. You can have the country, but you keep the system. And Mandela signed on to that, and the results in South Africa, which I visit regularly, are not very good. If you go into the townships, all the townships which were once the site for huge rebellions against the system of apartheid, people will tell you nothing has changed. We still have the same number of outside toilets that we had under apartheid. We are still being deprived of our electricity if we can't afford to pay the electricity company. And so there are huge problems, huge, huge problems in that world. And the hope, which was that Nigerian oil and South African technology and progress would help the rest of Africa, it's actually wrecking those countries themselves, because in the case of Nigeria, they're ruled by an extremely corrupt elite, whose only rival is the elite in Pakistan. You know, their rivals as to which is declared the most corrupt country in the world each year. And Pakistani civil servants, very cynical but intelligent, will joke with you, oh, the Nigerians beat us this year, and you know what, we should have bribed those people to make us the top. Systemic injustice in the system, the question about that, yes. No doubt about it, and worse now than it was before. Because during the years when the Soviets existed, again on the level of economics, social democracy was encouraged. It was very interesting that as the Wall Street crash was taking place, they had, I can't remember who it was, a very intelligent economist, maybe it was Robert Reich, I'm not 100% sure. Of the Clinton administration. He was being interviewed on US television, and they said, but why can't we have a New Deal now? Roosevelt did it. Why can't we have it now, on that pattern? And this economist politician replied, well, we can't have it because at that time we were facing the Soviet Union and a threat of communism, which was a more egalitarian system, and we were frightened that if we didn't do something, people would move in that direction, and there were trade unions, and they were really active, and so we had to do it, but now, who needs it? So it's all these things are interrelated and interlinked. So yes, there is systemic injustice of the worst order now. You know, where ordinary people with no real everyday interest in politics get angry when a banker, just last week in Britain, gave himself £1 million bonus. Such a huge outcry. And this is a bank that is owned by the government because it was bailed out. And that's the other interesting point. That, you know, all these people, great believers in the neoliberal system, the state can't do anything. When they are collapsing, they go on their knees before the state. Dear state, please help us. Don't help the poor, don't help the needy, help us. We really need it. So, yeah, the problem is, it's not that people don't recognize that there is systemic injustice. They don't have a belief at the moment in any alternatives. That is the real problem. First question on why the United States and its allies keep backing Saudi Arabia is very simple. Huge oil reserves and a monarchist dictatorship which has done the business for them since before the Second World War. I mean, the British created this family and put it in place. Kim Philby's father, H.A.R. Philby, was the British intelligence operator in Saudi Arabia. They had choices. There were other tribes more representative in Saudi Arabia, non-Wahhabi tribes, but they went with this one, and it's proved effective for them. So they don't care about anything else, really. I mean, the system works for them, for the West. So carry on with it. I mean, what was quite entertaining when, you know, entertaining in a sort of awful way, when they decided that Gaddafi, who had been an enemy, then he had been made a friend again. For the last 10 years, he was a valued friend, pouring money into English educational institutions, especially the London School of Economics. Tony Giddens, then the head of the London School of Economics, flying to Tripoli, praising Gaddafi and saying that his Green Book, which I would advise everyone never to read, that this little Green Book had a lot in common with Tony Blair's Third Way, which was probably accurate because both were effectively bullshit. But in return, the LSE got a lot of money, which they didn't declare, which they kept quiet, and that then blew up into a huge scandal. because Gaddafi was soon not to be a friend again and had become an enemy again. And I asked in public at the LSE, I said, well, you know, nothing that Giddens and those bunch of Blairites who were running the LSE did surprises me, but let me ask another question. How many British institutions, especially Arab and so-called security studies departments, are getting money from Saudi Arabia? Why doesn't some bright investigative journalist find out now so we have a list? So that then we don't, you know, let's sort of stop it now, and let's not wait till this wretched royal family is overthrown, as it will be sooner or later. Let's do it. No one replied. And that money is there. Guantanamo is a, you know, appalling business. Obama had promised it would be closed down. One of the few promises he made which one could agree with, because by and large he didn't promise too much. But this promise has been totally betrayed, Guantanamo, because the military wanted, because it's useful to lock people up without trial indefinitely till they die or till they commit suicide or till they're total wrecks, and then you can release them into asylums. And the reason the Canadian imprisoned in Guantanamo hasn't come out is because the United States take Canada for granted. And because Canadian governments aren't capable of really making a big issue out of it. Even the British got a few Brits out of Guantanamo, who now everyone says were innocent. But the Canadian government increasingly, over the last decades, and since the end of the Cold War, because that removed all the space even for states to maneuver. I'll give you one example. During the Vietnam War, not a single Western European ally of the United States sent troops in. The British Labour government refused. They backed the war, they didn't send troops in. 2 countries sent troops, Australia and South Korea. Compare that to Afghanistan, where Obama boasted when he was being given the Nobel Peace Prize, and 42 countries are fighting with us in Afghanistan. In Canada, I note that CBC still refers to the Afghan war as a mission. Well, that's very sweet, but it's totally inaccurate. It's not a mission, it's a war. People are being killed, people are dying, people are resisting, people are fighting. And it's wrecking a neighboring country. So that's the reason that Canada is seen now as a total vassal state with no real independence of its own. It follows the United States. Ignatieff would have been exactly the same, if not worse, by the way. He backed the Iraq War when he was teaching at Harvard against many other Harvard professors who were very good on it. So I don't think he would have been too different. The NDP, I don't know. I mean, you know, I have a feeling that were they to be in a coalition government, they would fight on some things, but on foreign policy they would probably cave in. You know, they've done on many other issues. I mean, they even wanted to change their name to the Democratic Party, but thought it was decided to delay the process for a bit. So I'm not optimistic about Canadian politics, and there was a time, you know, under Trudeau, for instance, that he had quite an independent foreign policy, for instance. Didn't go along with everything the United States did. But again, it is linked to US hegemony, which developed after the defeat of the Cold War enemy, that this became the world's only empire, and to fight it was not easy, though people did resist and are resisting it. And all the Western governments, by and large, fell into line. The Germans and the French refused to fight the Iraq War. The Germans refused to go into the Libyan War. The German Foreign Office issued quite a strong statement. So with the partial exception of Germany, and I would have thought that given all the war films that are constantly made about the heroism during the Second World War, it'd be a good idea for the United States and other Western countries not to force the Germans to participate in wars. I mean, it's quite a nice thing that there's a strong pacifist spirit in that country now, and there are good reasons for it. So to daunt them for not joining the wars. That and Guantanamo, I mean, I have to say this, that I think, and I've said this to the Cubans, they should have put up a bigger fight, and they still should, saying that there's base was not given to you, or not agreed with you to torture people and use it as a torture and detention center, but to keep your troops there. And had this been part of it, we would have resisted the treaty. And the fact that they've been silent is not a good, is not a good thing. But as long as they've got it, they'll use it. I mean, you know, surely they could have countries which support them wholeheartedly, offering sort of tiny prisons or concentration camps on a small scale to put these prisoners in. I mean, Harper wouldn't object, the British certainly wouldn't object, the populations probably would, I hope, but the governments wouldn't, so why keep it there? Because they would be forced to try these people. And that is what they want to resist doing, because they don't have the evidence to lock them up. I mean, some of the cases that have come out are completely appalling. So I hope that that answer has also satisfied the last question from the woman who introduced herself as a first-generation Canadian. I mean, first-generation North Americans are few and far between, for reasons that we know. And I think given the hysteria about immigration in the United States and occasionally in this country too, when something happens, it is worth recalling that these countries are migrant countries, and that the first migrants from Europe came as settlers who more or less wiped out or drastically reduced the native indigenous populations here, which did not happen to the same extent in South America, by the way. Also worth noting, possibly a difference between Protestant fundamentalism and Catholic fundamentalism, and the Jesuits, who had much bigger faith in their capacity to convert people, whereas some of the Protestant fundamentalists who came didn't feel that the savages should be converted. So, you know, this goes a long way back, but at least people should remember that all these countries, or these two countries in North America, Canada and the United States, have been built by migrants. And I'm not talking about the early settlers, but the settlers who have, the immigrants who have come over the last century and a half, whoever they may be. So for them to turn against migration is actually disavowing their origins and their past. Thank you.